For most of his career, Alex Volkanovski was defined by control. Control over distance, control over pace, control over preparation. He wasn't reckless, emotional, or careless. He followed the rules. He trusted the process. And for years, that discipline made him untouchable. But this story isn't about the night Volkanovski lost a fight. It's about the moment stopping became impossible for him psychologically, professionally, and personally. Because when your entire identity is built on always pushing forward, slowing down doesn't feel safe. It feels like failure. And somewhere along the way, Volkanovski crossed a line where continuing felt easier than stepping back, even as the margins disappeared and the risks quietly multiplied. This video isn't asking what went wrong in one fight. It's asking a more uncomfortable question. What happens when the system that made a champion refuses to let him stop, and he doesn't know how to stop himself? There was no single moment when Alex Volkanovski clearly fell apart. No dramatic implosion. No obvious mistake that instantly explained everything. What made this collapse difficult to notice was how reasonable it looked while it was happening. Volkanovski kept accepting fights. He kept preparing the same way. He kept showing up with the same discipline, the same calm, the same belief that if the work was done correctly, the outcome would eventually follow. On paper, nothing was reckless. The timelines were tight but manageable. The decisions were aggressive but defensible. The body looked ready. The mindset sounded confident. And that was the first warning sign. Because champions usually break when something feels wrong. Volkanovski kept moving forward because nothing felt wrong enough to stop. Each choice made sense in isolation, but together they formed a pattern that quietly removed his margin for error. Shorter recovery windows, faster turnarounds. Less room to absorb damage, adjust timing, or simply let the nervous system reset. None of it triggered alarms. It just normalized pressure. And once pressure becomes normal, stopping starts to feel unnecessary, even dangerous. The shock wasn't a bad performance. It was the realization, in hindsight, that Volkanovski never created a moment to pause. He didn't give himself a checkpoint to reassess what his body and reactions were actually telling him. He trusted preparation more than feedback. He trusted discipline more than hesitation. And for a long time, that trust was rewarded. But at the elite level, success can hide damage better than failure ever could. Small delays in reaction time don't announce themselves. Slight changes in rhythm don't feel dramatic. They just shrink the space where control used to live. The shock came not when Volkanovski lost, but when observers realized how long he had been operating without a safety margin. He wasn't chasing glory. He wasn't gambling for attention. He was simply continuing forward, because forward was the only direction his system recognized. And that's what made this moment unsettling. There was no clear signal telling him to stop, no obvious breakdown forcing a reset. Just a slow tightening of constraints until every fight demanded perfection with no room for human variance. The shocking part wasn't that Volkanovski lost control in the cage. It was that the conditions that made control possible had already disappeared quietly, logically, and without resistance long before the outcome made it visible. To understand why Alex Volkanovski couldn't stop himself, you have to look past tactics, matchups, or even results, and focus on the identity he built long before the losses ever happened. Volkanovski wasn't shaped as a fighter who relied on gifts, reach, or moments of brilliance. He became elite by proving, repeatedly, that he could outwork, outlast, and outcontrol anyone put in front of him. Every step of his rise reinforced the same lesson. Progress comes from pressure, and survival comes from refusing to slow down. That belief wasn't accidental. It was rewarded at every level. Shorter opponents were neutralized through pace. Bigger threats were dismantled through preparation. Championship fights were won by doing more, not less. Over time, never stopping stopped being a strategy and became a definition of who he was. The problem with identity-based success is that it doesn't adapt easily. When a fighter wins because of a system, he can adjust that system. But when a fighter wins because of who he believes he is, stopping feels like betrayal. For Volkanovski, slowing down wasn't framed as smart recovery or strategic patience. It felt like hesitation, like weakness, like giving something up. And champions who rise this way don't usually notice the shift until it's too late, because the same traits that made them reliable also make them rigid. Volkanovski didn't see himself as someone who needed breaks. He saw himself as someone who handled pressure better than others. That distinction matters, because once pressure becomes proof of worth, removing it creates doubt. Each fight accepted, each camp started, each timeline compressed, reinforced the idea that saying yes was the correct response. Not because it was always optimal, but because it confirmed the identity he trusted. The system around him didn't need to force him forward. His own standards did that job, and the more he succeeded, the harder it became to question those standards. There was no dramatic ego involved, no public bravado about being invincible, just a quiet certainty that his way worked, because it always had. But identities built on endurance rarely include exit conditions. There's no internal mechanism that signals when adaptation should replace persistence. Instead, the fighter keeps applying the same answer to a problem that is slowly changing. In Volkanovski's case, the cost of maintaining control began to rise, while the tools he relied on demanded increasingly precise timing to function. Yet, the identity didn't shift. He wasn't trained to stop. He was trained to continue. And once continuation becomes non-negotiable, the line between discipline and compulsion starts to blur without anyone noticing in real time. By the time questions about slowing down even became relevant, Alex Volkanovski was already operating inside a system where saying no didn't feel like a neutral decision. On the surface, he had leverage. He was a champion, a proven draw, a reliable professional. But modern UFC dynamics don't reward stability the way they reward momentum. Champions are expected to be available, adaptable, and replaceable in theory. Even if not in name, Volkanovski didn't need to be pressured directly. The structure itself created incentives that quietly narrowed his options. Short-notice opportunities weren't framed as risks. They were framed as tests of legitimacy. Staying active wasn't presented as a burden. It was presented as proof that a champion was real. And once that framing is accepted, declining a fight stops being about health or timing and starts feeling like surrendering relevance. Volkanovski understood that the system moves quickly. Divisions don't pause. Narratives don't wait. If one champion slows down, another steps forward. That awareness doesn't come from paranoia. It comes from observing how momentum is redistributed in real time. He didn't want to be managed carefully. He wanted to remain undeniable. And in the UFC, undeniability is often built through availability. The system doesn't need to punish fighters for saying no. It simply continues without them. For someone like Volkanovski, whose identity was built on reliability and preparation, being absent felt more dangerous than being overextended. Recovery windows shrink not because anyone enforces them, but because accepting compressed timelines becomes normalized. Each successful turnaround resets expectations. Each completed camp under pressure becomes evidence that the next one is possible. Over time, the fighter becomes proof that the schedule works, even as the margin quietly disappears. Volkanovski wasn't ignoring warning signs. He was responding logically to the incentives in front of him. The problem is that systems optimize for outcomes, not longevity. They reward the appearance of control, not the cost of maintaining it. When preparation becomes the answer to every challenge, there's no built-in signal to reassess whether preparation is still enough. Volkanovski didn't feel trapped. He felt trusted. Trusted to handle more. Trusted to deliver. Trusted to adapt. And that trust can be more binding than pressure because it aligns with the fighter's self-image. Saying yes confirmed that he was still the standard. Saying no would have required redefining his role inside a structure that rarely pauses to accommodate redefinition. By the time fatigue, timing, and recovery started to matter more than strategy, the system had already done its work. Not by forcing him forward, but by making forward motion the safest option available. And once that logic takes hold, stopping isn't just difficult. It stops existing as a real choice. Decline at the elite level rarely announces itself with weakness. For fighters like Alex Volkanovski, it shows up as something far more subtle, a shrinking margin where control used to live. The techniques still work, the conditioning still holds. The preparation still looks flawless. What changes is the timing, not enough to feel alarming, but enough to demand perfection where flexibility once existed. Volkanovski didn't suddenly lose speed or awareness. What began to slip was the buffer that allowed him to absorb mistakes without consequences. Reactions that once landed clean now arrived a fraction late. Reads that used to feel automatic required an extra moment of confirmation. None of this registered as failure. In real time, it felt like normal variance, and that's what made it dangerous. Champions aren't trained to respond to subtle inefficiency. They're trained to override it. Volkanovski compensated the only way he knew how, by tightening discipline even further. More structure, more precision, less improvisation. But control doesn't work linearly. The tighter it becomes, the less forgiving it is. Small miscalculations that were once survivable begin to compound. Footwork has to be exact. Entries have to be timed perfectly. Exchanges can no longer drift. When control starts demanding perfection, every fight becomes narrower, not safer. Volkanovski was still dictating pace, but the effort required to maintain that pace was rising. And rising effort without rising output is the quiet signature of decline. The body wasn't failing him. It was asking for adjustments he wasn't prepared to make. Not because he lacked intelligence, but because adaptation would have required loosening the very system that defined him. Volkanovski had always won by reducing chaos, by removing uncertainty, by turning fights into solvable equations. But as margins disappeared, those equations demanded exact inputs every time. There was no longer room for error, recovery, or recalibration mid-fight. The decline wasn't visible in highlights. It showed up in transitions that didn't fully reset, in exchanges that ended neutral instead of dominant, in moments where pressure maintained position but no longer created damage. Control without payoff is exhausting, and exhaustion doesn't need to be physical to be limiting. It can be cognitive. The mind starts working harder to produce the same result. Decision-making slows, not because of confusion, but because there's no longer slack in the system. Volkanovski didn't appear desperate. He appeared precise, but precision under pressure is fragile. The more exact the system becomes, the less tolerant it is of disruption. Decline, in this case, wasn't about losing tools. It was about losing elasticity. And once elasticity is gone, every fight demands absolute execution just to stay level. That's not collapse, that's compression. And compression, sustained long enough, eventually removes all room to maneuver. Collapse didn't arrive for Alex Volkanovski as chaos or panic. It arrived as discipline taken too far. The same structure that once gave him clarity began to demand obedience. Every response became pre-planned. Every adjustment had to fit inside a framework that no longer allowed deviation. What used to be a system for winning quietly turned into a system for surviving narrowly. Volkanovski didn't lose trust in preparation, he doubled down on it. And that's where the collapse truly began. When a fighter responds to shrinking margins by tightening control instead of expanding options, discipline stops being adaptive and starts becoming compulsive. There was no moment where he chose the wrong strategy. The strategies were correct. The timing, however, no longer forgave them. Discipline assumes the body will execute as instructed. Compulsion ignores feedback when it doesn't. Volkanovski's system was built on repetition, reliability, and minimizing risk. But once elasticity was gone, minimizing risk required more effort than the body could consistently deliver. Every exchange became a calculation that had to be perfect. There was no longer room for feel, rhythm, or instinct to absorb uncertainty. The collapse wasn't visible as recklessness. It showed up as rigidity, as sticking to the plan even when the plan stopped producing separation, as maintaining control without creating relief. When discipline turns against a fighter, it doesn't push him to stop. It pushes him to push harder, and that pressure compounds invisibly. The mind remains calm, while the system underneath it begins to fracture. Volkanovski didn't panic, because panic wasn't part of his identity. He trusted structure more than sensation. He trusted process more than warning signs, and that trust delayed recognition. By the time results no longer matched preparation, the answer wasn't to step back, it was to reinforce the system that had always worked. But systems don't fail all at once. They fail when conditions change and the response doesn't. Volkanovski wasn't fighting opponents anymore. He was fighting the narrowing gap between execution and consequence. Every mistake carried weight. Every delay mattered. The collapse wasn't about being outmatched. It was about being trapped inside a method that no longer allowed improvisation. When discipline becomes non-negotiable, it removes the ability to listen. And once listening disappears, even elite preparation can only repeat patterns, not correct them. Volkanovski didn't lose his skills. He lost the flexibility to deploy them freely. And when flexibility is gone, the system that once protected a champion becomes the mechanism that accelerates his fall. After the collapse, there was no dramatic fallout for Alex Volkanovski. No public unraveling. No excuses. No visible attempt to rewrite the narrative. What followed instead was silence, and that silence said more than any explanation ever could. Fighters who lose suddenly often rush to redefine the moment. They point to mistakes, circumstances, or timing. Volkanovski didn't do that. He didn't distance himself from the outcome. He absorbed it, and that absorption revealed something uncomfortable. There was no alternate story ready to replace the one that had failed. His identity had been built so tightly around control, preparation, and forward motion that when those stopped producing results, there was nothing left to articulate. Silence isn't weakness in this context. It's absence. The absence of justification. The absence of deflection. The absence of a framework that still makes sense. Volkanovski didn't look confused. He looked empty of narrative. And for a fighter who had always understood himself through structure, that emptiness was the clearest sign that the system had finally run out of answers. There were no promises of reinvention, no declarations of transformation, just a quiet acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted without permission. Silence also exposed the final cost of never stopping. There was no rehearsal for this moment. No language prepared for what happens when discipline doesn't work. When a fighter has trained himself to override doubt, he doesn't develop tools to process it when it arrives anyway. Volkanovski wasn't broken emotionally. He was unanchored. The routine still existed. The habits remained intact, but the certainty that once held them together had dissolved. This is the part of collapse that rarely gets discussed. Not the loss itself, but the void that follows when the method that defined you no longer explains the outcome. Silence becomes the only honest response, because anything else would require pretending that the system still functions. And for the first time in his career, Volkanovski couldn't rely on pressure, preparation, or persistence to speak for him. The silence wasn't dramatic. It was final. It marked the moment when continuing forward stopped answering the question that had always guided him. By the end of this story, the question isn't whether Alex Volkanovski can win another fight. It's whether he can exist without the system that once made him unbeatable. For years, moving forward was never a choice. It was a requirement. Pressure wasn't something to manage, it was something to prove. And discipline wasn't a tool, it was an identity. That identity worked until it didn't. Not because Volkanovski stopped believing in it, but because the conditions that supported it quietly disappeared. What makes this collapse unsettling is how rational it all was. There was no rebellion against the process, no rejection of preparation, just consistency applied, past the point where consistency still protected him. The same logic that built his career also removed his ability to step away from it. And that's the uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. Some champions don't fall because they lose discipline. They fall because they never learned when discipline should end. Volkanovski didn't fail to adapt inside the cage. He failed to redefine himself outside of it. When your entire sense of worth is tied to continuing, stopping doesn't feel like rest. It feels like erasure. This video doesn't argue that Volkanovski was wrong to push forward. It asks something harder. What happens when a fighter survives by refusing to stop and one day discovers that stopping is the only way to survive? The answer isn't clear, and maybe that's the point. Because for the first time in his career, forward motion no longer guarantees clarity. And the most dangerous moment for a champion isn't when he loses control. It's when he finally realizes that control was never permanent to begin with.